Let me say hello to West. Hello, Chair West.
Good morning, John. How are you?
Pretty good.
Nice to see you.
I'm an ugly Steve Bennett here today. How you doing, sir?
I'm well. How you been?
Pretty good. Doing okay.
Staying healthy and safe?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Good, good.
And I love the background. That's beautiful back there. Where is that?
That's Lake Louise up in Canada, Alberta, Canada.
It's beautiful, beautiful. Yeah. Okay, so.
We just have a couple of minutes. Good morning, David. How are you?
Morning, guys.
Good morning. Let him go ahead. Okay. Mr. Borger, good morning. Haven't seen you for a while. John Zaragoza.
Hi, John. Good to see you again.
Yeah, like Tony, haven't seen you for a while.
Hi, John. I'm Tony Tremblay. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, all right. How are you?
Morning, David.
Hi, Tony.
Thanks, Ben.
Chair West, we are ready whenever you are.
All right, thank you. I'm going to wait until the clock strikes. It has. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. It is 12 o'clock noon. We will call to order the December 14, 2020 special meeting of the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency Board of Directors. With that, I'll ask everyone to please rise wherever you are and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, everyone. Roll call, please.
Chair West.
Yes.
Director Mobley.
Here.
Director Zaragoza.
Here.
Director Tremblay.
Here.
Director Borchard.
Here.
Welcome, everyone. With that, we will recess this meeting and go into closed session to return at a scheduled 1:30, assuming we keep our schedule. So I will see you on the next link.
Just a pleasure to meet Mr. Mobley and on Zoom. Supervisor Zaragoza, it's an honor to meet you.
Likewise, John.
Thank you.
Are you sure? Yeah, that's good. This way, if you talk, they catch it again.
Keely, are you there and ready for us to resume?
Yes, we are ready whenever you are. Can you hear me, Chair West? Oh. Yes, we are ready whenever you are.
All right. It is 1:32. We will reconvene the a special meeting of the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency Board of Directors. Um, And with that, let me ask for an agenda review. Any changes or recommended changes to today's agenda?
One item to highlight, Chair. Item number 7 did not have a board letter attached when this item went out. You, the board members, and should have gotten it on at least 2 different occasions, including from the clerk of the board this morning. And it's on the website and available to all the stakeholders at this time. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Why don't we then proceed to public comment? This is an opportunity for members of the public to address the board on matters not otherwise on today's agenda. If you wish to be heard, please raise your hand to be recognized by the clerk of the board.
Mr. Nauman?
Can you hear me now?
We can, Dan. How are you?
Doing well, sir. I just wanted to give a little kind of a good news message from Lake Piru this fall, which we've never done before. We did a release from August, September, October, ending in early November from United Water Conservation District. And we released 33,400 acre feet of water from the dam. And with that, we spread 8,100 acre feet down in the Freeman diversion between Satakoy and Real Spreading Grounds. And we also delivered 3,400 plus acre feet to the pipeline services to our PTP system and to Pleasant Valley Water County district.
Okay.
And out of that release of 33,400, 8,988 acre feet was state purchases between transfers from City of Ventura and our state Table A water allocation. So I just want to kind of share that good news message that we put a lot of water in the ground, and by spreading the spreading grounds, we're able to help the nitrate issues on our pumping program for the OH system, which delivers water to the city of Oxnard, Port Hueneme, and the bases and other mutuals. So that kind of completes my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Merry Christmas.
I agree.
No other scene, Chair.
Thank you. Moving on then to board member comments. Any members of the board wish to be heard on some topic before we move on to the regular agenda? Okay, hearing none, then we will move to item number 6, which is the board's special meeting calendar.
Good afternoon, Chair West and board members. This is Keely Royas, and I'm the clerk for the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency. Number 6 on today's agenda is a returning item from the December 2nd board meeting. Agency staff was asked to look at alternate dates for the special board meetings for calendar year 2021. We have switched the board meetings from Friday afternoon, the second Friday afternoon, to the second Monday of each month in the afternoon for your consideration.
Questions or comments from the board? Let me just then open it up and ask if there are any questions or comments from members of the public on this item.
None seen, Chair.
All right, let's, coming back then to the board, is there a motion to approve the proposed 2021 board special meeting schedule?
I'd like to make the motion to approve as presented.
And a second?
Second.
Thank you. We need a roll call.
Chair West.
Chair.
Yeah.
Discussion.
Oh, you-
I'm sorry, if we got a little bit of discussion. To me, I don't see what difference is Monday or Friday. I don't know how the rest of the directors feel, but frankly, no special meeting is
is welcome.
But Monday seems just as difficult to me in terms of my schedule. I don't know how the rest of you feel.
It varies from day to day, week to week. So,
Mr. Chair,
yes.
yeah. Mondays are okay with me in response to Director Borchard. And I understand Mr. Mobley's motion to be for Mondays, which of course I seconded. So I'm hoping I seconded it correctly. All right.
You did. Okay, thank you. Let's proceed with the roll call.
Chair West,
Yes.
Director Mobley,
Yes.
Director Zaragoza,
Yes, even though I'm not going to be here.
Director Tremblay, Director Tremblay,
Yes.
Director Borchard.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Moving on then to item number 7, the contract with Jarvis, Fay, and Gibson.
Yes. Good afternoon, board members. I will be presenting this item, which is a recommendation that your board authorize the executive officer to execute a modification to the legal services agreement with Jarvis, Fay, and Gibson to assist the board or the agency with moving forward to create a replenishment fee for the basins within the agency. This is also a returning item from your December 2nd meeting, and is shown in the board letter and the attachments. There has been some further refinement of the scope of work, which lead to a proposed budget of $203,000. This would encompass all legal and consultant services needed to get us to the point where notice of a proposed fee would be published and a hearing set in front of your board. The proposal is that Jarvis Fay retain the consulting firm of Bartles, Wells and Associates. This is a firm that this is a consultant that Jarvis Fay has worked with on other projects, and they recommend. The process for getting to a replenishment fee is laid out in both Jarvis Fay's memorandum and in the proposal from the consultant. The first step has been accomplished in terms of identifying an appropriate consultant. The next step would be to identify those projects that the agency wishes to fund, and then to perform a rate study in support of those projects. There is a proposal to perform the additional work that would get us to the actual implementation of the fee. Our proposal is that we would return to your board to seek that authority to do the additional work once the projects are better identified and the amount of the fee is better known. With that, I'm available to take any questions.
All right, any questions or comments from the board?
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Alberto, walk me through, I have questions both with respect to timeline and cost. As I'm reading the memorandum, it starts off by indicating that the entire process would take between 10 months to a year and a half. But as I walk through the memorandum, it appears, based on the time estimates that are set forth in the memorandum, that it could be substantially longer than that. And in fact, it could be, depending, I mean, it could be substantially longer than certainly than 10 months. And I recognize that part of this, I guess, is whether or not the board goes forward on the 218 notice and hearing process, but can you comment on that? Maybe my math is just wrong in terms of adding up the number of months in the proposal.
I think you've correctly identified the disparity, but I believe the reason, or one explanation for that, is that there may be some overlap with the tasks to be performed. For example, there is the issue of whether the agency can and should pursue bond funding, for example, to create a reserve that would be available to purchase water on the spot market. At this point, it's unknown, and we'll need further analysis of whether that is the feasible option. If that drops out, then the schedule would go more quickly. But at this point, there is that uncertainty about how long it will take. There is also uncertainty created simply by the fact that this is the first time that the GMA will be adopting such a fee. And also, frankly, because there is a lot of litigation in the basins for which this fee would be adopted, and the sensitivity of that, and the anticipation that there could be additional legal challenges filed, and the importance of getting this right. And so the proposal builds in that level of uncertainty. So yes, 10 months is probably optimistic. It could take us well into 2022 before the process is completed. And also the other variable that the consultant is dependent on us for is that the first step is to identify the projects that will be the subject of these fees. And at this point, it's just unknown when those projects will be sufficiently developed for the consultant and the attorneys to move forward with the work that they need to do.
Mr. Chair, follow-up question?
Please.
Alberto, thanks. Can you also walk me through the amount of $203,000? How it adds up to $203,000? Again, help me on my math.
The proposal is for an additional $178,000. There's an existing contract with a not-to-exceed amount of $25,000. I hope I have that number right. So it includes the existing budget and then the additional fees that would be payable under the added scope of work.
And I take it that some of those fees have been expended to date on the initial $25,000 amount?
They have. We did engage Jarvis Fay earlier this year for the purpose of supporting the agency's adoption of replenishment fees, but they also provided services with regard to the fee that was adopted earlier this year to restore the GEMS fund. And I don't have the exact figure, but I believe the fees to date are in the range of $15,000. So there's approximately $10,000 left on the existing contract.
Okay, thank you very much.
Any other questions from members of the board? Hearing none, let me then ask questions or comments from members of the public. Please raise your hand.
Mr. Petrowitz?
No, it's Peter Goldenring. Good afternoon, Chair West and members of the board. When I look at this paperwork, I'm not clear as to the concept in terms of how these folks and or your staff are thinking about a basin replenishment fee, because when I read it, it seems to me to be some sort of variable amount. By that I mean it's going to tie to water pumping or amount of water used. And thus at the wellhead, which is not a property tax bondable location, at least not to this point, in terms of a public works bonding structure for projects, it's just becoming money comes in and money gets spent, as distinguished from making the determination that the basin replenishment fee is going to attach to the land, be carried on property taxes, and be bondable like any normal public works project, whether it's sewers or the like. I didn't see that in any of the paperwork, and it seems to me that is, for lack of a better term, a fundamental decision that the board needs to make around what is this basin replenishment fee going to look like? Is it a 218 fee in terms of a vote? Because from my point of view, we would want a basin replenishment fee that is tied to property tax bills and thus bondable, which means the board then gets the money necessary for the projects at the front end instead of just dribbling and drabbling it in. So I'd ask that this be clarified in terms of where this replenishment fee is going, because I think that'll ultimately answer a lot of questions that flow from that structure. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
None seen, Chair.
All right, thank you. My problem with this proposal is that it's similar in some respects to Peter's comment. Is the questions that I had that I think inspired retaining the firm aren't really answered or don't seem to appear to be within the scope of work, and the scope of work seems to include things we are not even close to being able to consider. The primary question that led to retaining this firm is can the agency, given its current rate structure and the way it's currently organized with respect to collecting fees and the like, can we go, basically would a new fee be bondable, and what would it take to accomplish that? And if that's so, what does it take? If not, what are our other options? And this right away is jumping to a rate model and a rate study, and we are years from being able to accomplish a rate study. Again, those rate studies have to be tied to projects, specific projects that are engineered and cost, and we don't have any of that. And it seems to me we're front loading a retainer agreement for work they're not going to be able to perform this year or next. I don't get it. I would rather see a narrow agreement that answers the questions that, the question is, when it comes to replenishment fees, what options do we have? And, given the way the agency operates, can we bond for replenishment projects? And that's the start, I think, before we start paying for a rate model.
Chair, that sounded like a good motion, and I would second it.
Well, I guess let me turn it into a question, if I may, and Alberto, if this is something that you can answer, or anybody else, is why? Why are we accelerating the pace of? And believe me, there's nobody more interested in accelerating things than I am. But why are we going directly to a rate model and a rate study before we have the answers to some other fundamental questions?
Well, the answer is that this is work that will need to be performed regardless of the answers to those questions. And the idea is that they would proceed simultaneously. And as those questions are answered, we would return to your board with a further report as to whether, for example, the ability to pursue bond financing is available to the agency. But the reason it's being proposed as this all-inclusive project is that we not hold up the process of getting to a replenishment fee while we wait for the answers to those questions. We do have some preliminary responses or analysis that has been done, but the idea of pursuing bond financing, in addition to being new to the agency, it's a complex area of the law, and it will require further study. But regardless of the answer to that question, we will need to pursue the 218 process, and that will require a rate study and the identification of projects that the rates will fund. And so that's why it's being presented this way. But the intent is that the scope of work would include analysis sooner or in the short term or the shorter term to identifying the agency's options. But the other work will need to be done. So the recommendation was to approve all of the work and not just the analysis of the options. But we can certainly come back to your board with that narrower scope.
Well,
If
I don't mind the scope of work as long as the understanding is we're only going to pay for the analysis that we need at the time, because I don't want to pay a couple $100,000 or $178,000 for work on a rate model and a fee study that we're not going to need for a year and a half from now. Because you're right, until we get those projects identified, selected, engineered, and cost out reliably, there's no point even considering a rate model or a fee study.
Chair.
That's going to take time.
Chair West, if I may, Jeff Pratt, staff to the GMA. This is a very much an iterative process. Will be several checkpoints along the way with your board where we check in on the public policy. Do you want a big pile of money fast? Do you want a big pile of money slow? How much you want to put for water? It is designed this way to be as efficient as possible and to allow us not to do multiple contracts on the same issue. At the very most, if we went all the way to the end of the road on this, the very most we could get is just what these varying costs would be, depending upon what your board says, per acre foot of charge. It wouldn't be assigning it to anybody. The much more difficult public policy will come later in how it's assigned by management area, throughout the GMA, by property, by pumper, so on and so forth. But there is a lot of work involved, and it's a chicken and egg thing. So it's got to be an iterative process, and this allows us the flexibility and speed that I think your board was looking for.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Yes.
So Jeff and Mr. Chair, so I think you mentioned that if we approve this, it's subject to 218, subject to different options, it's subject to projects. So we're going to go into it phase-wise. Is that correct? As opposed to the entire gamut of options and projects and so forth. Is that correct?
If I understand your question, yes, it's going to be stepwise. It's a stepwise process, which will require reports back to your board, public policy decisions. Do you want to do this or do you want to do that? There are requirements your board's not going to be able to avoid, Prop 218, for example. But there will still be a lot of options for your board to explore. And this is a long bit of work, which definitely in the long term, at the end of all this, we're going to have to plug the projects in, get the real dollar numbers, and get back to your board with questions on how you want to allocate those costs.
And the costs will be allocated step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and all the way up through whatever we get to.
Yes, probably through step 100.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments from the board?
I have a comment, Gene. So,
Yes, please.
I mean, I don't think we should be approving this whole amount. I think I'd rather, I'd be more comfortable just approving it in steps of what's needed now. So I think we should just be funding the preliminary analysis for the options of funding the replenishment fee, given us, I mean, we know it's going to be a 218, but is bonds the best way to go, or just per acre fee or whatever? So we need that analysis. I think that shouldn't cost that much, but let's just stick with what we need at the current moment and just do it piecemeal. Because it seems like there's just way too much that's unknown in this proposal. Even though the scope of work is much detailed, a lot more detailed than the last time we looked at it, but I think we should just do it on a smaller scale at this point.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
one of the reasons I was struggling with this proposal, and I'm inclined to agree with both yourself and Director Borchard on this, and Mr. Mobley, is particularly on the top of page 3, and sort of the first step here is the detailed list of projects. And that's about a 3-month process. And then the next step, and I wasn't clear on what the next step is. I mean, without even getting to the other issues you've identified, Mr. Chair, it indicates that that they would work with the consultant to develop the fee model and a study that meets legal requirements, generate the revenues needed for the desired projects and are politically acceptable. And it was really kind of amorphous. I was having difficulty sledding through that, including questions on whether you have a fee that varies between basins and things like that. So I would agree with Mr. Mobley. I think what I would suggest is we approach this so we don't, I know everybody wants to move forward and move forward fast. Why don't we do the first step of this process, which is the detailed list of projects, and then ask staff and the consultant to come back with a second phase that is more detailed, and that gets to some of the issues that you've outlined. That would be my thought.
Let me ask this, Alberto, maybe you know this and maybe we don't. Do we have a sense of what the cost might be, or the contracted addition would be, in order to, I guess, do the first part of that analysis to basically advise the board with respect to what their options are with respect to project funding, before we get into the work that requires identification of projects?
Not specifically. The Bartles Wells proposal does identify a task 1, which I think would encompass the scope that your board has proposed, and that's a little over $7,000. I don't have an estimate of what the Jarvis fees would be just to accomplish that initial stage.
Yeah, but unless I misunderstand the process, Bartle Wells can't do anything meaningful until we give them the list of projects and those costs. And it's more than a list of projects, because in their study, they're going to have to assess, how the basin benefits in general from the project, and who in particular within the basin benefits and how much. It's a much more detailed analysis that they'll have to undertake. But they don't start their work until we identify what the projects are, what the scope of the anticipated scope of those projects will be.
Chair, if I may, it's Jeff Pratt again, staff to GMA. Part of the criteria for considering projects will likely be cost. Where we envision this going was being able to give you, say, a per 20 million or per 30 million, the options, those sorts of things, right, and the pros and cons, so that your board could consider cost as one of the criteria you'll use to weight the projects, and in addition to all the others you just mentioned. Another thing that you should be aware of is that it was clear to me anyway at the last meeting that we weren't going to be able to get you the detailed scope of work that you're discussing right now in the week that we had to do. They just can't do it. And so we could certainly come back again with, either a series of contracts or one large contract with set points and deliverables. But I think what you're discussing right now is a series of contracts.
I think you're right. I mean, I would certainly be more comfortable with that, particularly given the length of time that we're talking about. If this was all work to be accomplished in the next 3 or 4 months, then I would agree, look, one master contract to get everything done makes sense. But since we're talking about a process that is really likely to take 1 to 2 years, I think we would benefit by having the detail in some separate contracts with the respective contractors.
We can try to break that up into meaningful bites, but if we and come back to you in January. In other words, I still think your board would prefer something of a longer contract, so because you realize the mechanics of monthly meetings and coming back. So your board has to first wrestle an issue to the ground, make a decision, and then we have to open another contract. So we have to go to do a scope of work for that, bring it back the next month. I don't think your board wants that series of steps, but so we'll try to break it up into sort of meaningful bites, maybe 6 months of work or something to that effect.
Well, as an alternative, if there was I guess one large all-inclusive contract with triggers built in, so that, the work was reported out to the board on a regular basis, and it was only after that report and the concurrence of the board that the next phase of the work engaged. That might make more sense. That would certainly work as opposed to a series of separate contracts. But my concern would otherwise be just endorsing one large, contract and losing control over the process over the next year or two or longer, if that's how long it takes.
Well, that was certainly our intent, was to be back to your board. We can build that into the contract. It's just going to take a lot more time than we had to get that done. So we could build it into one with the set points your board is comfortable with and bring it back to you. Yeah, hopefully we can get it to you by the end of the month.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Yeah, I would certainly endorse the approach of having a longer contract, because then you have a framework that all of these items are going to be accomplished, and you have what I think you use the term triggers. You've got opportunities to come back to the board at regular intervals, and then depending on which way the board goes, then one or more of those options may not end up being explored. But it also gets to the issues that you outlined earlier in the conversation. So I think holistically it would be better to have a longer contract. So my thought would be have staff go back, bring us back that type of approach at our meeting in January.
Anybody have any objection to that approach? Okay, why don't we then just simply make that the direction to staff to return with this item and along the lines of the detail that we discussed, giving the board an option to review each phase of the work and trigger or engage on the next phase. Jeff, you need anything further on this?
No, sir. Think we've got the direction we need.
All right, thanks. Let's move on then to item, let's see, is it item number 8?
Good afternoon, Chair West, members of the board. For the record, I'm Tim Loeb, GMA staff, and this item is to authorize and approve an agreement with Farallon Geographics to develop a data management systems requirements analysis for the agency. And I will share a PowerPoint I have here. So hopefully you're seeing that screen now.
Yes.
All right. And if I can.
I can have my sandwich.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Didn't realize that was on.
I was delayed in advancing. So as your board well knows, and we've talked about number of times, the GMA needs to either upgrade or develop a new data management system. It was identified as a priority in a workshop your Bellard held in January for GSP implementation. And some of the new things that we need to address are management of the AMI data, water market allocations, monthly extraction data. Right now, the system's set up for semi-annual, and we've gone to monthly, and monthly is what we need for modeling of the basins for our GSP updates, and then GIS-based for transition to land-based allocation. And in the subgrant agreement that we have with Nature Conservancy, it's a Natural Resource Conservation Service subgrant that funded the water market pilot and AMI installation for agricultural operators, was a task for developing a new data management system. And the grant was for in-kind labor, but Nature Conservancy has indicated that there is some grant funding, and they intend to go to a modification to provide funds for this scope of work that we're proposing here. So the agency issued a request for proposals in September, and it's to identify and document both current and future business processes that need to be supported by the data management system, and develop a comprehensive requirements document that will we can use to move forward into identifying and procuring a new data management system. The scope of work in this proposed agreement and then as it was identified in the RFP is a phase 1, which is a review of the agency operations and our current data management system and our future data management needs. Phase 2 is then documenting that in a comprehensive data management systems requirements document. Phase 3 is to conduct research and provide recommendations for what existing software or software services or software that could be integrated together might be to provide the needs that are identified in the requirements document. And then optional phase 4 was to assist with issuing an RFP for the system itself in the future. So we received 3 proposals by the closing date of October 13th. The cost estimates were received in separate sealed envelopes, and a review committee ranked the proposals based on the qualifications and the criteria identified in the RFP. Farallon Geographics of San Francisco was selected for the award, and their cost proposal not to exceed is $64,200, which was right in line with our estimate, our engineer's estimate, if you will, of around $65,000. Farallon did opt not to include phase 4 in their proposal because they would like to reserve the opportunity to potentially propose on the system itself in the next phase of work. And the proposed schedule is to complete the project 4 months from the date of award. And it needs to be completed, Arnie can confirm if I'm off here, but I think it needs to be all completed and built out through in May to be included in the grant funding. So that concludes my presentation, and the recommendation is for your board to authorize the executive officer to enter into a consultant services agreement with Farallon Geographics to conduct the operation and business process review and data management systems requirements analysis for the not to exceed amount of $64,200.
Thank you, Kim. Any questions or comments from the board before we open it up to the public?
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Actually, I do. And so I'm looking at page 2 of 3 of the staff report and page 9 of Farallon's proposal. And my question has to do with the phase 4 optional, because Farallon has declined to include phase 4 in its proposal. So they've got the ability to potentially review and respond to the data management system RFP. And I guess my question is this: I mean no disrespect to Farallon, but and my question is for you, Kim, does it not strike you as at least a potential conflict if the consultant prepares the data management system requirements, which is phase 2, and makes recommendations for data management solutions, which is phase 3, and then that same consultant responds to the phase 4 RFP? In other words, they're writing the specs that they would then respond to, and it strikes me as, and again, no disrespect to Farallon, but it strikes me as a conflict.
So Director Tremblay, that is, in an interview, we did talk to Farallon about the potential appearance of that. I think that the requirements document itself will is really documenting what the agency needs in terms of functionality and features. It's not specifically recommending a technology or a particular solution. Phase 3 is sort of a market review of that. With Farallon not proposing, if they're not preparing that, GMA staff will prepare that and send that out. And I have confidence that the scope of the requirements document will not color specifically a specific solution. I think the solution will come out of the work itself. And I actually expect that whatever it is going to be an integrated solution of multiple existing software solutions.
Mr. Chair, can I go with some follow-up on this?
Sure.
Well, Kim, let me approach it from a different angle, and that is, did the other proposers propose doing the phase 4 work?
They did.
Okay. And what do you estimate, what does staff estimate as the phase 4 cost in and of itself, setting aside the first 3 phases, which I think, 65,000, that was consistent with staff's estimate. But how much do you think that phase 4 is going to cost?
That 65 was an estimate for the 3 required phases. We did not estimate
Right.
phase 4.
Oh, it's not been estimated yet, but we've budgeted for it, haven't we?
And well, this is in fact going to be funded through, we did budget funding in this fiscal year's budget, but this is going to be reimbursed through the Nature Conservancy grant. That was going to be a smaller scope of work, I believe.
For phase 4.
But yeah, phase 4 is a much smaller scope of work, helping to prepare the RFP and then manage that process, or assist us in managing that process, is much smaller scope of work than phase 1 and phase 2 are really the meat of this scope of work.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions from directors? Hearing none, let me ask if there are any questions from the public. Please raise your hand to be recognized.
None seen, Chair.
Thank you. Returning them to the board. Any further discussion? And so then, is there a motion to approve the recommended action, the contract with Farallon Geographics?
Motion to approve, Mr. Chairman. Zaragoza.
Thank you. And a second?
I'll second it.
And a roll call, please.
Chair West,
Yes.
Director Zaragoza,
Yes.
Director Mobley,
Yes.
Director Tremblay,
Respectfully, no.
and Director Borchard.
Yes.
All right, moving on then to item number 8 on the, number 9 on the agenda. The pumping allocation ordinance for the Las Posas Valley basins.
Chair West, members of the board, Kim Loeb again, this is my item. And this item was continued by your board to today's public hearing meeting from the October 28th meeting. And I will share my presentation here again. You should be seeing it, and based on my experience a moment ago, there it goes. Takes a moment to come back up. So if your board will bear with me here, this is a reasonably long presentation. It's an item that your board's been, and the agency has been working on, as well as stakeholders, for quite some time. We went through it at the August 14th first hearing, and but in discussions with folks, it's clear that there is it would be helpful to run through things again so everything is fresh. And just for the short history, really work began in earnest in 2014 with the Las Posas Users Group working on a new allocation system. They were entered into a charter with the agency in 2016 to develop the new allocation system, and that work resulted in what they called their white paper. That was presented to your board at workshops. Your board worked favorably on that white paper. In the meantime, there was a group that had trouble with that, and they also came to your board, and then the adjudication was filed, and the work went on hiatus However, in October of last year, your board passed the new allocation ordinance for the Oxnard Pleasant Valley basins and said that you wanted to see a new allocation ordinance and get off of Ordinance E by October of this year in all the other basins. We had a number of meetings with your board earlier in the year, working out some details. Agency staff held a workshop webinar for stakeholders in July, published some preliminary calculation what the new allocation would look like in August. And then at the August 14th board meeting is when your board held the first reading of the proposed ordinance. And your board directed that we make some additional revisions to more closely conform with the LPUG white paper, simplify the minimum allocations for agricultural operators, and return to your board for consideration of adoption with January 1st, 2021 operative date. And as I mentioned at the top, that was scheduled for the October 28th meeting, at which time your board continued it to today's meeting. The draft ordinance in the package is unchanged from that which was part of the October 28th package. So again, it's based on the white paper. It does indicate that the ordinance, that your board recognizes the ordinance will be interim until such time as the court adjudicates water rights in the basin, and that would make revisions as appropriate. Includes provisions from a stipulated agreement between the parties in the basin, revised on your board's direction, and will go into effect as it's written in the packet, January 1st, 2021. So the main purpose of the new ordinance is to facilitate transition to sustainable groundwater management under SGMA and have fixed groundwater allocations. And again, it concludes specific language that your board would make modifications at such time as the Supreme Court completes an adjudication as appropriate or required. It would replace the allocations in Emergency Ordinance E and the Agency Ordinance Code. It continues to assign allocation to extraction facilities, which is the GMA's historical process. It allows continuing of combining multiple allocations for reporting within a management area into what we call a COM code. And it does provide that for variance for specific circumstances where an operator needs to operate in more than one management area, such as zone, mutual water company, and waterworks district number 19. So new in the ordinance since the August 14th reading is that it includes provisions for transitioning into the water year, into the second quarter of the water year. The current water year started October 1st. This would start January 1st of 2021. And we would need to prorate the allocations for 9 months for the period January 1st through September 30th. And similar to the work we did for the Oxnard and Pleasant Valley basins, we analyzed AMI data to see how much of the agricultural pumping, since ag wells had AMI in 2019 at the start of the year, how much of that pumping was represented of the total year's pumping, and it showed that the majority of wells pumped 80% or less of the total annual extractions between that January and September period. And similarly, monthly reporting by urban water suppliers to the state water board showed that they used 80% of their total water production between January and September. So the ordinance includes the new provision that sets allocations in this first year of January 1st through September 30th, 2021, 80% of the annual allocation set by the rest of the ordinance. Additionally, in the ordinance, since the August 14th period, your board directed a waiver of surcharges for certain extractions in the Oxnard and Pleasant Valley basins during the first year of implementation to reduce uncertainty and allow for an easier transition to the new allocations, time for processing, variance applications and whatnot. So in the revised ordinance before you today, it includes a similar surcharge waiver for the abbreviated first year. So the September or January 1st through September 30th. And it's based on the reported extractions in 2018, identical to what was approved by your board in the modification for OPV. However, it's prorated 80% because this is a 9-month period. And 2018 was selected because it was a dry year. In 2019, extractions were quite a bit lower because it was a wet year, and we clearly appear to be into a dry year, unfortunately. So this is a review. At this point, the ordinance identifies allocation pools. This is straight from the white paper: an East Las Posas management area, a Pool 2, that's the Ventura County Waterworks districts, and Pool 1, which is every other pumper in the East Las Posas. And the yield shares are from the stipulated agreement between the parties. Similarly, there's a similar division in the West Las Posas. And then the ordinance identifies the Epworth Gravels management area. It's identified in the GSP, but the yield share in the Epworth Gravels management area is considered part of the East Las Posas management area. And that's consistent with that stipulated agreement and those management area yield breakdowns as well. Initial allocations are based on the maximum pumping in one of two base periods, 2009 through 2013, or in 2015, or alternatively a minimum allocation for the analysis and the published preliminary allocations that we published to the website ahead of the August meeting. We evaluated the maximum extraction for a given COM code during that 2009 and 2013 or the 2015, and then for that COM code, whichever was the greater extraction, then we applied that to all the wells. That was a more equitable way of looking at this than by well, because a COM code that has multiple wells, they may be rotating their wells, pumping in any given year, and that would provide an advantage if we did not look at it on a COM code basis in order to identify which was the period of the greater pumping. And then that finds the pro rata well allocation. We bring it back to the well in each management area, and then the ordinance says that they are reduced on a pro rata basis to bring the extractions in line with the available yield for the management area, which we'll talk about in a moment. The ordinance based on the white paper includes reserve allocation pools in the east and west Las Posas. This is principally for land that was not irrigated or developed to irrigated agriculture prior to the base period. So this is essentially 2016 and later, and establishes a reserve allocation pool of 670 acre feet a year in the east and 320 acre feet a year in the west. Minimum allocations are also established. We'll talk about the revised agricultural minimum allocations in the next slide. For domestic operators, it's 2 acre feet per year per well serving 1 to 4 residences. And for other operators, essentially M&I operators, it's their temporary extraction allocation, or TEA, established under Ordinance E, including all the scheduled reductions, and also including any variances granted under the T by the executive officer, so it preserves those variances that were granted as a minimum allocation for those M&I operators. For ag operators, your board asked us to simplify this minimum allocation, and really the minimum allocation for ag operators serves 2 principal purposes. The initial purpose is the assignment of allocation from the reserve allocation pools. Down the road, as your board may consider allocation reductions to achieve sustainable yield, it would set a floor for what those allocations could be reduced to. So for the white paper, the LPUG analyzed aerial photos and water sources and mapped the potential developable unplanted land in both the east and west Las Posas. And that's how they came up with those 2 reserve allocations we looked at. And based on that, these are the minimum allocations that were used for the white paper effort. For the reserve allocation of 1.280 acre feet per year per acre for East Las Posas and 1.367 acre feet per year per acre in the West Las Posas. And so the revised draft ordinance includes using these minimum allocations for the purpose of setting allocation from the reserve allocation pools, and then includes a provision that the minimum allocation floor to be utilized for reductions to achieve sustainable yield be worked on and developed and adopted by your board at a later date. That's going to be based on the sustainable yield of the basin and the total irrigated agriculture being irrigated by groundwater. It's a complex effort that we would undertake in parallel, but before your board would consider reduction of allocations. So this is the table that we presented at your August 14th first reading, and this is consistent with what was published to the web. It's slightly revised numbers, but this is the exact table that was presented August 14th. And it's a lot of numbers, but what I want to focus your attention at is you can see my cursor here, can you? Well, maybe not. All right. So what this is broken up into is the East Las Posas, the West Las Posas, and then the basin as a whole. And it has the 2 pools. The reserve allocations come out of the pool 1 because that is for the pool 1. Pool 2, you remember, are the waterworks districts that were set aside with their own percent of allocation. And then The first column is the average annual extractions in each of those pools in the total basin in 2009 through 2013. Then what the extractions were in 2015, the 2018 extractions, the 2019 extractions. You can see those, because it was a wet year, those extractions were lower. Then if we take the total of all the COM codes, or all the wells from their highest pumping period, that comes up with a total of 44,651, which is more than any pumping because it's kind of a hybrid. Then the next column is the pro rata pool allocation from the stipulation, which shows how much goes to pool 1 and how much goes to pool 2 of the available yield in each of the management areas. And originally we had shown your board the initial allocation stipulation pool where that was all prorated down to the 36,000 ahead of the August 14th meeting. Stakeholders said, well, that's not what we had intended. So we had proposed that the allocation pool would be adjusted to the 2018 extractions because that's a dry year. Now you'll notice it doesn't match up exactly. So what the proposal was, and this again, this was presented at the August meeting, that we would take the 2018 extractions, actual report extractions in pool 1, so that's everything but the waterworks. Then set aside the reserve allocation. So for instance, in East Las Posas, you can see it's 20,558 was the actual report extractions. We set aside the 670 from there. And then that represents 87.41%. Then if we take 12.59% of the available pool, that represents 3,057 acre feet for pool 2. If you add those together in East Las Posas, it's a total available yield to start with of 24,285. And do the same thing in West Las Posas. The overall total available yield to start with is 39,963, essentially 40,000 acre feet. Before I move on, that was a lot of numbers I threw at you. I think that we've talked about this before, but I know it's been some time since we have. If there's any questions before I move on into the other elements of the ordinance. Okay, we can come back to that if we need to. There are additional reporting requirements that we had included in the first version of this ordinance. We had them similar to what we had in the OPV allocation ordinance. The reporting that we would need to track the allocations to land. Several for operators of ag extraction facilities, they need to report parcel numbers, irrigated acres of each parcel, and the source of water used to irrigate each parcel. This is similar to what's being reported in Ordinance E now under II. But several mutual companies objected to identifying their specific deliveries to specific customers and those customers. And so we have modified the ordinance to allow the bulk reporting of monthly water supply to a group of parcel numbers so that it is equivalent to what mutuals or water districts supplying water to M&I users would be reporting. Allocation carryover remains unchanged. It is the same as the OPV allocation ordinance. Just as a reminder, the white paper identified the need for allocation carryover, but did not identify any methodology for it. They did not get that far. Your board spent a considerable amount of time, many meetings and committee workshops to get to this allocation carryover. And it is that operator may carry over up to 50% of their unused annual allocation in any 1 year. They carry over up to 100% or 100% of that year's annual allocation into the next year. The first water used in any year is deemed as exercise of carried over water, and the carried over allocation expires after 5 years. Now, some of the feedback we've heard in the Oxnard Pleasant Valley basins, I think there's a little bit of misunderstanding about how that would actually work. If an operator had an allocation of 10 acre feet and they used 5 acre feet, had unused allocation of 5 acre feet, that would be carried over into the next year. Then they have their new 10 acre allocation for the new year and the 5 acre feet they carried over. If they used the first 5 acre feet they pumped, would be their carried over 5 acre feet. If they didn't pump anything more, then they could carry over another 5 acre feet of their allocation. And for that reason, as long as they're pumping each year, the carryover expiration of 5 years, practical standpoint, really does not have a implication, because you're generating new carryover each year. For an accounting purposes, for combined wells into a COM code, this has been a problem in IAI. We need to track to the well so that we can have it at that granularity, especially if wells move from one COM code to another. At the end of the year, any carried over allocation is just evenly divided among those wells. So the allocation transfers between management areas is generally prohibited. That was specifically called out in the white paper, and makes sense because there are separate allocation pools for the two management areas, for the west and the east. There is, as we talked about up front, there is an opportunity for exemption for those two water purveyors that have wells commonly operated in the two management areas. We had proposed that if one of those operators, they have their allocation in the east and allocation in the west, if they pump their allocation in one basin, they would have to make it up the following year to balance it out. Zone said that was not feasible within their operation, and so we've revised the ordinance to state that that has to be balanced on a running 5-year period in order to keep the pumping consistent with each of these operators' allocation in the two basins. So the reserve allocation, we talked about the reserve allocation pools that are identified in the east and the west for land that is brought into production in 2016 or later. It would be limited to the water in the reserve allocation pools. It would be set to the minimum allocation. And there were 4 priorities for establishment of those reserve allocation that were identified in the white paper, and the ordinance includes those priorities as they were set out there. The ordinance includes opportunity for application of variance similar to other ordinances of the agencies. And the sole purpose of variances are so that an owner operator can make reasonable use of the groundwater in the same manner as other users in the management area or basin. The applicant for a variance has the burden of proof of establishing several standards, including that the variance won't convey a special privilege, or the denial of the variance would result in a hardship, and the granting of the variance would not be inconsistent with SGMA, any of the other ordinances of the agency, or the agency's ability to manage the basin sustainably. Because your board recommended coming back to, let me back up on that thought. The ordinance included the first year that variances needed to be received by December 31st. Because your board continued this item to this date, and we're already in the middle of December with a January 1st implementation date that is in the ordinance as brought forward from August 14th. We recommend that this be pushed out to February 28th for accepting variances. But in subsequent water years, variances have to be applied for by September 30th for use in the following year. And one of the questions that we've received is, does this mean we have to apply for a variance each year? And no, that's not the idea. But once the variance is granted, if it's a permanent variance to the ordinance, then that continues. This would be for new variance requests. So the ordinance includes a section for provides that your board can make reductions to the allocations in the future as needed to bring the basin to sustainable yield by 2040. But there's no proposed reductions in this ordinance. That would be something that your board would consider at a later date. And there is a provision that no reductions will occur until such time as the fixed minimum allocation floor for the agricultural operators has been established. So per your board's direction, at the 14th meeting, the ordinance will become effective on January 1st. Because it would become, let me back up and say, an ordinance becomes effective the 31st day after it is adopted and then becomes operative on the 1st. Staff recommends that this language be changed in order to apply to extractions beginning January 1st, 2021. So it would state the ordinance shall take effect on the 31st day after adoption and be operative as to all extractions starting on January 1st, 2021. Oh, that's redundant, sorry. So the ordinance has several other findings for your board, and that specifically in terms of SGMA and CEQA. SGMA provides a statutory exemption from CEQA. CEQA provides exemptions for activities without possibility of causing significant impact and taken by regulatory agencies authorized by state law. The proposed ordinance will facilitate transition to sustainable groundwater management under SGMA. SGMA requires that any action limit groundwater extractions be consistent with the applicable elements of any general plans within the area, that it applies to. The GSP, Board of Los Pozos Basin, includes a discussion of how land uses may affect the water demands and the agency's ability to manage those basins sustainably. And based on the GSP and use of the base period established the initial allocations, the proposed ordinance complies with SGMA's requirement for general plan consistency. I should point out that Cayugas Metropolitan Water District has expressed a concern that the proposed ordinance would impose surcharges for extraction of stored water associated with their ASR program. We don't believe that it would. There's no specific provisions in either Ordinance E or the agency's ordinance code, and Cayugas has been operating for years without that specific provision. And we expect that this allocation ordinance would operate in the same way. But we recommend that Cayugas's ASR operations be addressed through a board resolution at a later date. That's how your board has handled other specific special projects, such as the Canal Creek project or the Oxnard's Great project. And so, but we did want to relay to your board Cayugas's concern in that regard. So the next steps are that once your board adopts the ordinance, staff will send out notification owners to the registered owners and operators, notification letters. Did I say that? To owners and operators registered with the agency. It'll provide a summary of the new allocation system, notification of the new allocation for each of the wells that are registered with the agency, including the semi-annual extractions in agency records during the base period. Request that those operators and owners confirm that the data are consistent with their records, and if they're not, bring that to our attention. And also notifying the owners and operators of the variance process for specific special circumstances or exceptional characteristics of their wells. Your board may want to consider also, following adoption of the ordinance, appointing a variance review committee. Your board appointed a variance review committee for the Oxnard and Pleasant Valley basins. In that instance, the variance review committee is limited to specific types of variance applications. The LPUG white paper considered a variance review committee just in general might be appointed for a broader purview than that, but that's something we would return to your board for consideration after adoption. Your board established the OPV committee by resolution. So that concludes my presentation, and the recommendations as they are in the staff report are that your board receive this presentation, conduct a public hearing, find that the proposed ordinance is exempt from the California Environmental Quality Act, and it's consistent with the land use elements of applicable general plans, and consider adoption of the ordinance.
Thank you, Kim. Any questions or comments from the board before we convene a public hearing on this item? Hearing none, then we just ask if we will at this time convene a public hearing with respect to the proposed ordinance and invite members of the public who wish to be heard to raise their hand to be recognized.
Mr. Candy.
Can everybody hear me?
Now we can hear you, yes.
Okay, my name is Peter Candy. I'm an attorney with the law firm of Hollister and Brace, and on this matter here today, I'm representing Fuller Falls Mutual Water Company. Fuller Falls, as you may know, was established in 1980. It provides agricultural and domestic water service to approximately 500 acres of agricultural land overlying the East Las Posas management area. On September 17th of this year, 2020, the Fuller Falls submitted a letter going on record with regard to a number of concerns, problems, issues they had with the proposed ordinance. I'm not intending to reiterate each one of those concerns, but I do want to just highlight a couple of points. The first concerns really the methodology by which the ordinance proposes to assign extraction allocations. And really a concern that we have is that it's this dual approach, really taking the greater of average annual extractions over the base period 2009 to 2013 or extractions in 2015 creates an opportunity for winners and losers, and really the more appropriate approach from Fuller Falls perspective would be to establish a longer single base period, which very similar to what your board did with regard to the Oxnard Pleasant Valley Basins, a 10-year base period in that case, which then would more equitably assign extraction allocations, and it would not allow any particular party that may have, for whatever reason, pumped in excess of what they normally would, and they did so in 2015, to be able to capitalize on that windfall in effect. Again, I mean, the approach generally creates the opportunity for those windfall type situations. Our letter points out a couple of different circumstances where that's the case, and we just wanted to make sure the board was very clear in that regard. I do understand that this was part of the LPUG white paper proposal. Nevertheless, as your board well knows, not everybody agrees with each and every element of that white paper proposal. Moving on to the second point, and that's how the ordinance then takes pro rata percentages for each operator's extraction allocation and applies it to available yield. And in this case, the initial available yield, beginning with adoption of the ordinance, would be the annual extractions in 2018. And this has a pretty severe effect on Fuller Falls Mutual Water Company. It would reduce their extractions by, I believe, 17%, what they'd be entitled to, even though they've been very efficient with their water use throughout. In any event, there's, in our opinion, no reason for such an immediate reduction. The agency has the opportunity to bring extractions into line with sustainable yield over a 20-year period. There's no reason right up front to impose immediate reductions. That certainly wasn't how the board approached the situation in the Oxnard Pleasant Valley Basins, and we'd advocate for a similar type of approach here. No initial reductions through this pro rata approach to assigning extraction allocations. The third and final point I'd like to make really concerns flexibility. The operators under the proposed ordinance, and as well as whatever the water rights adjudication comes up with in terms of physical solution, is going to be facing pretty substantial cutbacks over the coming years, and flexibility is really critical. And the carryover provisions that have been essentially brought over from the Oxnard Pleasant Valley allocation ordinance aren't adequate to really create the opportunity for these water users to carry over from wet years into dry years, and maybe over a number of years as well, like really wet periods when their pumping isn't as significant, to be able to carry over into dry periods when they are going to have to rely on the basin. There's conversations currently through the facilitated process to try to open up and create more flexibility with regard to these carryover provisions in the OPV ordinance. these provisions in this proposed ordinance are identical, and for the same reasons, I think, need to be reconsidered, looked at. There's ways that accounting can be done to make sure that the system isn't gamed, and it would be a shame to ignore those opportunities simply for purposes of nothing else than simplicity, right? And imposing restrictions that don't create the needed flexibility is really shooting ourselves in the foot. And we'd like you to consider that as you move forward with deliberations and ultimately adoption of this ordinance. That completes my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Knoble?
You hearing me?
Yes.
Very good. Thank you. I work with Levens Ranches. We are East Las Posas pumpers, a little bit larger than Fuller Falls, but I'd just like to follow up with a few comments on Mr. Candy's points. 2 items. I am beginning to understand the variance concept as explained to me, and Kim, thanks for answering those. We are definitely going to be outliers in the process, as are just the way the numbers pro rata numbers have come out. We are looking at anywhere from, if we start with 40,000 acre feet, next year would be 11% cuts and ultimately 23 to 24% to get to the maximum. Whereas in general, the East Las Posas Basin is looking at over that same time period an 8. So like Fuller Falls, we may, it's just the way the numbers came out. So not much I can do about that, but it is the way it is. I just wanted to point that out. So we would be individually hit pretty hard right up front and as we head towards the finish line. But I understand that's what the various process is all about, and we'll be following up on that one. The other point that he made was similar in the East Las Posas, a little drier soils. We don't have the water holding capacity. So dry years are much tougher on us than what we can save in a wet year. And that being said, carryovers are very important from year to year to help us stay in business on a long-term basis. And those are my comments, and thank you for taking them.
Thank you, Derek.
Mr. Grether?
Yes, good afternoon. Mr. Chairman and members of the board, I think the comments made by Mr. Candy and Derek Noble are very well said. They're definitely true, particularly the part regarding the mathematics of how the water allocations would be derived on a percentage basis, because I think all users, based on the formula that's being proposed, would immediately face a 10 to 20% cutback, which is, I don't think, really the intention of the GMA board. So I support those comments completely. The other part is that the carryover is very inadequate the way it's being done, particularly in the Las Posas Valley. For the most part, the Las Posas Valley has tree crops, and we can't hold a rotation of a crop out in the same way that the Oxnard area can. And so it will present a huge problem if we have back-to-back dry years. I think most everyone would immediately fall into the penalty situation if there was a drought of more than a couple of years. The other part of that is that the Las Posas users group proposed that a water market be established. And the water market has been a way for some operators in the Oxnard Basin to avoid penalties by using the water market. There is no water market established for the Las Posas Valley and Las Posas Basins. And so that presents another obstacle for the effective functioning of this ordinance. And just as a last point, and this has been said many times, this SIGMA does not require this ordinance to go into effect this coming January 1st. I think under all the circumstances that the board ought to consider deferring this for another year. It's not kicking the can down the road. It's trying to make it better. And so I would encourage you not to support the ordinance at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Mr. Goldenring?
Thank you, Chair West and members of the board. I have written a couple of letters, so I won't reiterate what is in those letters. I would specifically point your attention to section 8.3, which is what I view to be the double cram down on industry. There's only a handful of industry that's really in the Las Posas Basin, but the whole point of the TEA variance process was to figure out what was the actual necessity of the particular operation, in this case, the mine. And then once that was determined, and it was in fact determined by your board to be what really was needed, then there was the application of the reductions, which, as Chair Mulhart always said, was the notion of two trains leaving at different times, arriving at the same place. So we don't understand under section 8.3 why industry would be punished, as it were, with these scheduled reductions. So we would ask, if you're really going to go down this road, that you take out the words including all scheduled reductions, so that what industry has is, if there was a variance, then it's that variance, because that was the finding of necessity by your board. Now, one could read 8.3 to say that including all scheduled reductions only applies to an initial TEA, and a variance subsequent is exempt from that. But as a lawyer, I worry about the language. So I would ask those four words to be removed from 8.3. I would also just observe, as I've said in a number of comments that you have, that we just are at a loss to understand why this is being driven so hard and so fast, given the time periods available with the law for this to move forward. And when I look at Kim's charts, it's pretty clear that the usage of the water has been fairly consistent. It goes up in the dry years, it goes down in the wet years, but there isn't anything happening untoward. And so we would urge your board to step back and really think long and hard about how it moves forward, because it at least is our view, and when I say our, I mean all of the folks we represent, some 60 or 70, that this board should be turning its attention to confirming water rights to the land. The fact that FCGMA maintained its records by wellhead pumping it's a reason, but not a good one in our view, to not doing what is appropriate, which is confirming what was always said, that the water rights are owned by the landowners, and then moving forward with a credible basin replenishment fee that's bondable, and then this angst that you're hearing from everyone about how do we survive, it really will go away, because there will be enough water for everyone. And then the fear of this cram down, which is what this ordinance does, we think will go away. And we think that's a healthier place to go and a more proactive, positive place for this board to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Mr. McLaughlin?
Good afternoon, Chair West, members of the board. Russell McLaughlin on behalf of the Las Posas Farm Group, a large group of agricultural growers in the Las Posas Basin. My issue is one of timing. I'm actually quite shocked that there wasn't a single word in the presentation from staff today, to the public at least, on the fact that just last week the court set in the adjudication of the Las Posas Basin June for a trial over just this issue, which is the allocation matters. And the negotiations are presently ongoing. We've been meeting constructively with staff of the GMA, and it just seems to me that this is a recipe for further conflict rather than conflict amelioration by putting the GMA in front of the court on what's really a property rights issue. And it's effectively the GMA usurping a court process that is going to be resolved here in a matter of months. And it's not clear to, even though there are many things in this, in the LPUG proposal and in the fabric of the proposed ordinance that are not necessarily objectionable, it's not clear how this is going to impact negotiations and any further conflict before the court. The frank truth is that while we have agreement on a lot of things, many items are just simply not complete. There is ongoing discussions about the initial allocation formula, minimum allocations, and specifically how that applies and how it applies to lands that are served by other water than just groundwater. The variances and dormant allocations from the reserve allocation really should be, if possible, resolved up front, in front of a decision by the court. As you've heard, there's also questions about carryover and where the appropriate landing spot should be there. We're trying to coordinate constructively with all parties, including GMA staff, and we've proposed a process for further mandatory discovery so we could get factual claims out on the table for many of the issues I just mentioned that could be then further negotiated or, if necessary, tried in June. I just cannot, and speaking with the other landowner council and my clients, I'm at a loss to understand the rationale for moving this now as opposed to waiting for the court to act and then have this take effect on October 1st, 2021, the beginning of the new Sigma water year. There are no consequences from DWR. As you all know, this basin is not a critically overdrafted basin as identified by DWR. It didn't even need a GSP until 2022. There's no consequences of waiting. It would only ameliorate the problems. If you did wait till then, you wouldn't have to do a proration of 9 months. You'd avoid the prospect of further litigation over this ordinance itself. There's no real teeth in the next 9 months without surcharges in any respect. It just seems that we ought to use the court process to resolve this and hopefully what would be an amicable way. And I hope it is clear we are not in any way trying to avoid the issues of sustainability and needing to do allocations in the basin. Fully support that. Your staff and many of the landowners, including our group, band together to request the court affirmatively set this for decision in June for that reason. Lastly, there is substantial CEQA vulnerabilities of this act. Those are specified in a letter written and included in your board package for the October 28th meeting on my firm's letterhead, but signed by many of the other landowners. And in that letter, all of the signing counsel to that letter agreed that an October 1st, 2021 start date is the appropriate target to do this in a manner that would engender less conflicts rather than more. Thank you for receiving my comments.
Thank you, Rose.
Mr. Saperstein?
Thank you. Rob Saperstein, part of the Las Posas Farming Group, represent a couple entities that also signed on to the letter that Russ mentioned. And I just want to kind of tie Mr. Goldenring and Russ's comments together. Yes, property rights. Yes, the allocations need to be tied to land. It is what we have scheduled for the upcoming trial and the adjudication. But more importantly, our hope is that we negotiate our way through that and hand the GMA a completed package that deals with variance issues, minimum allocation issues, the transition from wellhead to a water rights land-based allocation system. And the GMA is ready to go by the new water year in 2021. That's the hope. That's the trial that we have scheduled. That's the purpose of the many, many hours we're already spending in negotiations, both with GMA staff and otherwise. There is just really no need to antagonize. Instead, we've invited and have worked quite well with GMA staff in moving this process along. I'm just really concerned that we're going to get now sidetracked in folks feeling like they've got to protect themselves and litigate this ordinance unnecessarily. I really encourage the GMA board to put this off until we get a little better sense of how things will move through the first 4 to 5 months of next year. You'll have plenty of time come June or July, probably even by April, having a sense of how things are going and whether we're headed to a trial or not, to reinitiate these discussions then with better information, a more ripened process among your stakeholders. There's a real opportunity here for the GMA staff and the board to get this package done more completely with less antagonism and more primed for success. I really encourage you to take advantage of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob.
No other comments seen, Chair.
Thank you. We'll, I guess, return to the board. Questions, comments, thoughts?
Chair, a question for Kim. Kim, we heard a comment that all users in the Las Posas Valley face 10 to 15% cuts immediately. Is that your impression?
Director Borcher, it's not my impression. We have had several conversations with the two operators that you heard from, Levens Ranch and Fuller Falls Mutual Water Company. They seem to be the more extreme cases of issues there. We felt that they are really primed for the variance process because of how they fell out. But yeah, I don't understand Mr. Gruther's comment there.
Is there? I'm trying to get a handle on if people are starting lower than where they were, because that was the general concept that we had all along was a people starting at the level of pumping that they were previously at with a recognizable and manageable ramp down.
Well, right. And because of the white paper and the ordinance's specification of the 2009 to 2013 or 2015 base period for the allocation, there is, anytime you take a base period that is different from pumping right today, there will be a bit of a different allocation among the operators. But as we talked about, you saw that table, What we propose in the ordinance is to then apply that to the 2018 pumping, and you can see that that worked out to be about just under 40,000 acre feet basin wide. So the math, if the pumping in 2018 was a little over 37,000, and in 2015 was just under 40, and it was a little bit less. It was like 39, if I recall. I don't have the slide in front of me right at the moment. 2009 to 2013 was about 39. Then overall, there can't be a reduction of 10% across the way. There may be where water use has changed significantly from the base period for what they're doing now, that they will in fact have a different allocation, or significantly different allocation, and that's the idea of the variance, to look at why that might be. And then the other thing that's in the ordinance is similar to the Oxnard and Pleasant Valley Basin modification that you made during the first year, in this case, the first 9 months, should your board choose to proceed on January 1st, the first year there would be, or 9 month end of the water year would be, the surcharges would be waived if their pumping was not more than the 2018 pumping, as these things get worked out.
Hey, Kim, I'm a little concerned with the January 1st effective date, particularly given the number of variances that are likely to be necessary. I know, and you may recall, David, as well, that at the when we first saw this presentation so many months ago at an executive committee meeting, the production number was 36,000, and because of stakeholder input and discussions at the executive committee, the number was revised to the 39 plus we saw in the presentation today. So I'm very surprised to hear the concerns about overall reductions, because that certainly wasn't our intent. And I can certainly understand that a lot of that may work itself out, or should work itself out in the variance process, but obviously there isn't enough time between today and January 1st for that to happen effectively. That as we have seen, that is a longer process than perhaps anybody anticipated originally. So I don't think it would do damage to the ordinance to consider adopting it with an October 1st, 2021 implementation date. That would allow time to get notice to all of the stakeholders about what their allocations under this ordinance would likely be, receive and deal with variances, and address some of the specific issues that have come up in today's discussion with respect to the ordinance. And it would also allow time for the adjudication process to play itself out either through negotiation or litigation, and without having to implement any of the changes anticipated in the ordinance, particularly if we did in the Las Posas Basin something similar that we did in the Oxnard Pleasant Valley Basin with respect to the waiver of a certain class of surcharges during the 2021 water year. Any thoughts or concerns with that type of approach?
Chair West, was that directed to me?
Well, I guess I was intending to direct it to you, but perhaps it's more broadly intended for the remainder of the board, yes.
Yes, well, I can speak for staff. Staff is certainly wouldn't have no objection. Would could implement the ordinance in that fashion should your board direct, certainly.
Any other thoughts, comments, or motions from any members of the board?
Gene, I'll offer a motion to adopt the ordinance as presented with the implementation date of October 1st, 2021, and find that the ordinance is exempt from CEQA. I think that's all I need.
And let me just ask Kim, Mike, was there a second finding the board needed to make as well in the course of adopting the ordinance? I know there was one to find that it was exempt from CEQA. Was there another finding?
Yes, Chair. Finding that the proposed ordinance is consistent with land use elements of applicable general plans.
And Michael, do you want to make that part of your motion?
Yes, let's include that in my motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there a second to the motion?
And I'll second that, Mr. Chairman. There it goes.
Any discussion, questions, comments? I will, then we'll.
Sure. Chair, comment.
Yes, please.
Maybe it's stating the obvious, or I don't know if it's obvious, but for me, the delayed implementation date makes sense. It covers off on some of the concerns we've heard regarding the litigation or negotiations that are going on. The surcharge holiday, as it were, that we implemented in the Oxnard Pleasant Valley basins also helps, in my mind, alleviate some of the pressure maybe some of the stakeholders are having for the possibility of surcharges and penalties while variances and things get worked out. The variance process will not be short and quick, as we've figured out from the Oxnard side. And so it's probably a reasonable amount of time, January to October, to get some of that sorted out just by itself.
Chair West. Any other questions or
yes,
comments?
Sure.
Yes, please.
May I seek a
I realize it's not a part of the motion, but just to make sure I understand, then the motion would also include then the concept of the waiver of any assessment of surcharges for the 2020-21 water year. So in other words, between October 1 of 2020 to September 30 of 2021.
That's what staff was proposing. Yes, that's part of the motion.
Okay. And I'll second it. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
So if I understand the motion correctly, it is to adopt the ordinance with an implementation date of October 1, 2021 to waive surcharges in the Las Posas Basin in the same way that we did in the Oxnard Basin for the 2021 water year, and to make the findings that the ordinance is exempt from CEQA and consistent with other land use ordinances as well. Is that correct, Michael?
That's correct. You got it.
Motion. You seconded, John?
Correct, second, yes, sir.
All right. If there are no other questions or comments, we'll proceed with a roll call.
Chair West, pardon me, before your board votes, if I could seek a clarification with regard to the language in the proposed ordinance. So with regard to the implementation date, Article 7 should be revised to reflect an October 1, 2021 operative date.
Yes.
And then there may be a need to also amend the variance application deadline, which is, I believe, Kim had proposed the February 28, 2021 deadline. And just to clarify, is that part of the motion or is some other date being proposed?
We didn't discuss any other date, assuming that the notices are ready to go out now, a February 28th deadline seems like a reasonable one.
Kim, would you propose maybe a later date for variance deadline? Would that work better for staff?
Well, Chair West, Director Mobley, that date is fine. Later date could be okay as well with an October 1st start date. For subsequent years, the ordinance says that waiver requests would just need to be submitted by September 30th of before the water year. I think it makes sense to, for the first year, perhaps to have an earlier date, but I think staff would be amenable to probably a June 30th date would make sense, with the understanding that they may not all be resolved by the date of the start of the next water year.
Okay, I'll amend my motion to say the variance deadline is June 30th, 2021.
And I'll second it.
For the first year.
And sorry, one more clarification. So the proposed ordinance refers to the current water year. That deadline would apply to the water year beginning next October, or October 1, 2021, correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
And Mr. Chair, I think one other modification that would be needed is the prorating to 80% in section 5.7 for starting in January. That section would no longer be relevant to starting on the first day of the water year.
Correct.
I'm a little confused on the due date for variances for applicants right now currently. Staff plans to get out those letters to the stakeholders when, Kim?
We will get them out in the first part of the year. So I believe that we can get those out by the end of January.
And then the due date for you to receive variances upon those letters?
June 30th is what's proposed in the motion.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
There's a motion and a second. We need a roll call.
Chair West,
Yes.
Director Zaragoza,
Yes.
Director Mobley,
Yes.
Director Tremblay,
Yes.
Director Borchard.
Yes.
Moving on then to the next item on the agenda, number 10. Is that not now moot?
Chair, yes, correct. That is now moot.
Okay. Let's move to number 11, the stakeholder engagement process.
Chair West, this is Jeff Pratt, staff to GMA. I'll be making this presentation. Recall that since the formation of your board has insisted on open and transparent stakeholder engagement and has practiced that in its almost 40-year history. With that in mind, recently staff recommended, your board approved some augmentation of staff for DWR, paid for facilitator in both the OPV and LPV basins. A core stakeholder group was formed in the LPV basin, but not in the OPV basin, excuse me, but not in the LPV basin. And that process moved forward starting in March of this year. a few weeks ago, we got a call from DWR requesting a meeting. And when we showed up for the meeting, the CBI facilitator was at the meeting along with DWR. And DWR, in a surprise announcement, told us that they were going to be pulling support for the facilitator effective immediately. And we were asked to come up with a scenario where that person could finish their work as planned in the original scope of work with DWR. DWR paid for the work up through that point. We asked CBI for a facilitation number to complete the work they had contemplated. It came out to $19,000. I proceeded on my authority given to me by your board, the $25,000, to enter into a contract to complete those services. That process is set to run out at the end of the year. The facilitator is going to continue with a group they formed, the legal committee, which was the primary reason that DWR pulled the money and the funding. They were afraid that the formation of the legal committee and as practiced by the legal committee tainted their facilitation support services, which was why they removed support. So we fully expect that the CBI facilitation will continue in the Oxnard Pleasant Valley Basin with the legal group, but their contract ends for the core stakeholder group. So what we're bringing you is a recommendation to continue that open and engaged stakeholder process using staff and or other means as your board sees necessary. What we've attempted to do in this board letter is set up something very similar to the prior processes we've used, but with improvements, slight improvements, given that in the past we haven't always had committees nor have we had an informed structure. The way we've developed that informed structure over the past few years in the SIGMA process. What you see on paper as a starting point for discussion is an executive committee, which would have a policy advisory committee composed of core stakeholders in the Oxnard Pleasant Valley Basin, a fiscal committee, which would have a fiscal advisory committee formed of core stakeholders in the Oxnard Pleasant Valley Basin, and an operations committee, which would have a technical advisory committee reporting to them. We would also recommend, given some of the problems that we experienced with the technical advisory group in the LPIC process, that technical advisory committee members be subject to Form 700 disclosure. So that we all know where everybody's working from. This item is meant to create a discussion among your board members on the appropriate process moving forward. And with that, I'll conclude my presentation and answer any questions you might have. We await your direction.
Any questions or comments from the board before we open it up to the public? Hearing none, let me then turn and ask any members of the public who wish to be heard on this item to raise your hand to be recognized.
None seen, Chair.
Thank you. Well, this is I guess, a request by the staff for direction from the board, and indeed, I think the board wants to see the stakeholder process continue, whether it's in the same form that it's been in or in a different form, whether it's with the staff facilitating the discussions or a member of that core stakeholder group actually facilitating the discussions. I don't have any objection to I guess, staff contracting for services, particularly if they're logistical services to coordinate and keep everyone on a regular schedule. I get one of the things that I've been told that the facilitation process, one of the values it brought was the fact that there were regularly scheduled meetings and not just simply ad hoc get-togethers on topics periodically. And I think that's something that we need to continue. And again, whether it's administered by staff or administered independently by a third party. I also think it would be a good idea for the different groups and the different committees to report to the board directly. To the extent that that core stakeholder group can select one or more spokesmen among the group to address the board with regular reports, that would probably be helpful. And I would recommend that to the core stakeholders group as part of their organizing work. At least in terms of the direction from this board member, those would be my thoughts. Anyone else?
So, Mr. Chair, can I kind of reframe what I think you just said? Make sure that I understand it. It would be to continue the core stakeholder group process by having the GMA staff facilitate or support that process with and we're providing them with GMA staff with additional flexibility to retain logistical or clerical assistance to assist in that effort, to continue to employ a series of regular meetings, preferably every 2 weeks, which I understand has been the schedule to date, with regular periodic progress reports to be made to this board, to the GMA board, and for the core stakeholder group to select a spokesperson to provide those reports to the GMA board and I would suggest that first progress report to this board be made and presented at this board's April regular meeting. Does that kind of capsulize
it does.
My understanding?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
And with regard to the core stakeholder group, I would offer that as a motion.
Well, I don't know that we need a motion. We just need direction to staff. So anybody have any other thoughts or different ideas that the staff needs to hear? So with that, then that will be the direction to staff. Jeff, do you have any other questions or items that you need answers from the board for?
I do not. That was very clear and specific. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, next we have an executive officer's report to receive and file. I just need a motion to receive and file the executive officer's report.
So
second.
And a roll call.
Chair West.
Yes.
Director Zaragoza.
Yes.
Director Mobley.
Yes.
Director Tremblay.
Yes.
Director Borchard.
Yes.
And with that, before we adjourn, I want to wish everyone a Merry Christmas, a Happy Holidays, a Healthy New Year, and get in line for that vaccine as soon as possible. Hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Likewise.
We're adjourned.
Thank you. Happy holidays.
Thank you.
All right.
Well.
So what was the vote on 5-0? 5-0.